with. How do we use technology to collaborate, especially during a pandemic and hopefully in its aftermath, to make these innovative projects and products and processes a reality to serve those most in need? And to talk about that, we are very privileged to have a distinguished panel with us. And I can say that from personal experience, just knowing them over the years, and also just working over the last month. It's just been a joy and a privilege to work with. The Honorable Judge Schneider, Housing Court Supervising Judge of the New York State Unified Court System. Johanna Santos Bassetti, Director of Product at JustFix NYC. Carolyn Robinson, Director of Massachusetts Legal Help. And Quinten Steenhuis, Clinical Fellow at Suffolk University Law School's Legal Innovation and Technology Lab. And we're going to try and make this a little bit interactive. So if you have questions along the way, please pop them into the chat, and we'll monitor that and pass them along to the panel as we go along. We have about 50 minutes or so for this presentation. And if we have some time at the end, we miss any of your questions, we'll try to get to as many as we can. All right, let's turn it over to our panelists. I think Judge and Johanna, I think you started off, yeah?
Oh, I think actually.
Oh, Quinten, you and Karen started off. All right.
All right. So hopefully we'll have a lot of interaction, a good group for people to be able to see. Are people seeing the right thing? You should just say Mass Access Project. I'm always a little bit worried that I'm doing it wrong.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. So today I just wanted to talk with you about a project that we have done over the last 6 months in Massachusetts, which we're calling the Mass Access Project. I'm really excited that we have some funding to take it national very soon. So I'm hoping that to be able to share that experience with everybody here and tell you what we've done. But don't think it's something that you can't do too. You can, and we can help you. This is the question that I think we're all dealing with. So what do we do with courts during a pandemic? What happens to the courts themselves? I think the obvious answer, of course, is that to some extent, they shut down over the last 7 or 8 months. And I want to tell you 2 stories that help make that a little bit more vivid and visible. So the first story is about a client of a colleague of mine who was facing domestic violence, wanted to try to get help for that problem pro se. She knew she had to file a restraining order. She went to the courthouse, and literally the courthouse doors were closed, so she was sitting on the courthouse steps. It took a period of several hours for a clerk to come out to her and talk to her about what was going on. She wasn't allowed into the court, obviously, for very good reasons. And the clerk came back and brought her a stack of paperwork to fill out, which was the restraining order. And I don't know, I think this experience is pretty universal in states around the country. That might seem like it's a fast emergency thing, but it's actually a very complicated procedure with many pages of paperwork to fill out, the typical one taking about 20 pages. I think, Caroline, you could really explain well here if you want to jump in and explain like what your experiences was with working with domestic violence survivors, filling out this form. And you're muted right now.
Sorry about that. So there are lots of very specific questions, but then of course the meat of getting an order from a court is your affidavit and how you explain, explaining why you need this, why you need the restraining order. And I think anybody, when they have to tell their story, in court and talk to a judge, it's very hard for anybody to put together some sort of cohesive, coherent explanation. And then imagine that you're in crisis, so you may not be thinking very clearly. And then oftentimes you will forget things that are really critical. Sometimes you may not, because you're panicked, you're not thinking clearly, you may not put everything in. But then you know, as many of you know, you go to court, you talk to the judge, and you tell them all kinds of things that they don't want to hear. They're not interested. You go off on tangents, and you don't really know there's no structure to your explanation, and you don't know what details are important and what details are not important. So on top of that, if you're low literate, to be faced with, this is actually a full letter size blank page. And this is where the meat of your argument for convincing a judge that you need a restraining order is. So it's incredibly intimidating. There's no structure and there's no help.
And here's another story that I think is really helpful that helped motivate us in our project. So this is a stock photo. I mean, it's a photo of someone's basement that's flooded. It's not, but this is a client story that we heard many times. If you're a tenant who was facing trouble with your landlord not repairing things, I think that was a common situation that people had. And that was an emergency need where someone needed to get to the court to get help right away. You can't wait 6 months for your basement to be repaired if there's water flooding it. And what we learned is early, there was triage going on. So people would call the court for help. If you're a tenant and you wanted to file a restraining order, you already have tried a number of things to get your landlord to do something about the problem. And those tenants were being put on hold. The clerk would call. They couldn't file anything on their own. They had to call a clerk to get something filed. The clerk would call their landlord, call back the tenant in a few minutes and say, oh, everything's fixed. You know, the landlord says they're going to fix the problem. And we know, of course, that a restraining order never got filed against the landlord. And maybe something happened, or maybe that tenant just gave up because of their experience with not being able to file something when they needed to in an emergency. So that was the backdrop for us. Those two stories were really motivating to us when our Chief Justice, Justice Gantz, who sadly passed away just a few weeks ago, put out a call to action at the beginning of the pandemic and said, what can you, as the legal community and the technology community in Massachusetts, what can you do to try to solve this problem? And we listened. And we got a more specific call to action too from the statewide Access to Justice Commission, who said, we know that you, with your experience, that you've done these projects relating to document assembly, to remote help. We think there's a project that you can do here. And we opened that call to action up wider. We ultimately had 100, I think, core volunteers who can say touch the project in a meaningful way. But if we look on our Slack channel, which is one of the communication channels we used to organize our volunteer pool, we had hundreds of people who responded to that, literally from all over the world, representing 5 different continents. These are some of the partners that we ended up working with together. And I'm going to talk with you about what our actual solution was in just a minute. So we didn't just have individuals, we had institutional partners that were able to be part of the project. And I think this is helpful too, to see this is just one of the screens of our very first Zoom meeting where we talked about the problem and what we thought some of the solutions were that we could come up with. I think we had probably 7 or so pages like this. And this is what we came up with. This is our concept. We decided what we wanted to do was to take all of that volunteer energy and to turn it into producing something that we know very well. And we wanted to try to harness that energy to do it the most efficient way that we could, which was producing what some of you are familiar with. We've called guided interviews as one of the terms that's really popular, but it's a step-by-step question-driven way to fill in court paperwork. We picked out 30 court processes that were emergencies that the court was going to still be open for during the pandemic. And we took all of those forms that were on paper and we transformed them into mobile-friendly, accessible, step-by-step processes that someone could complete on their phone and then deliver, very importantly, straight to the trial court. So at the end of that process, when someone's gone through the questions and answers, they have a form. But it's not just a form, it's a form that gets sent straight to a clerk who can then do something with it and make sure that's accepted. This is another part of the process that I think was really important, is that we're not just thinking about how does that person interact with the paperwork. We're also thinking about how do they interact with those traditional resources that are harder to connect with. So Those of you who are in legal aid, you know, you're working with your client. How do you replicate that experience when you're all remote? And one of the things that our workflow enables is for somebody to be speaking with their client remotely, either on a phone or via Zoom, and then for that paperwork to be sent to a tenant to sign remotely, and then get back to the advocate to then deliver it to the court. Or the other way around. It could be that a tenant or some other pro se person with whatever issue that they're trying to get help with fills in most of the work, and then they sign it maybe, and then it gets reviewed by an advocate who can confirm that everything is done correctly. And the way that we were able to leverage all those volunteers is by taking that work and breaking it into processes that can be done by people with just really discrete training. And we called it the document assembly line. So first there was a process of tagging files and PDFs and labeling them correctly so that they fit into a structure that we had developed. We built a tool that then turned those draft forms, which was just a PDF with some tags on it, and turned it into an interactive draft of an interview that someone could complete on their phone. Really important, there's some coding review. And then of course, review by a subject matter expert. And that was a loop that would happen multiple times to get a really polished draft at the end. I want to say that, of course, this isn't the end of the story. This was what was motivating us for this emergency need. But there are problems that people experience every day. And I liken this to a curb cut on a sidewalk. I don't know if people are familiar with that concept of universal accessibility. But before the pandemic, there were people who could not access the courts. What the pandemic has shown us is that remote access is something that can help everybody, every day of the week. But we're obviously having a huge impact on people who are in these pre-existing situations. People who have children who can't get childcare, people who are working during the hours the court is open, or when they would otherwise be able to talk with legal aid, people who literally don't have a home or don't have the money to be able to get to the court. I spent a lot of time working at a homeless shelter in Boston, and I was amazed. It was just a few miles from our main office, but when I was there to do legal advice and brief service, many of the people there could not afford to get to our other office, even though it's just a few miles away. And we're in Boston, where there was public transportation to do that. And then there's this population of people who are literally homebound as well, who don't have any other way to get to the court. Caroline, I think this might be a good place to jump in and just think through some of these ideas around the collaboration part, if you want to talk about that a little bit. And I'm going to...
muted. I keep doing that. I'm on quite a noisy street, so I think the thing is that when we collaborate, we needed, we need people who are on this project. We need people who have technical skills. We need people who have legal skills. And the other thing I think is that when we talk about, and we worked with the court, and we had the Office of the Court Interpreter Services was also involved. They volunteered to help translate our interviews once we got them to a point that they were satisfied enough in the English that we wanted them translated. But I think one group of people that we forget, our collaborators, are also the people who are going to be using the forms. And I think we just need to keep in mind that they are collaborators as much as any of the other people who are working on this project. And one example of that is when we first tested, I've been working on the restraining order for domestic violence survivors for quite a few years on a different platform. And the feedback that we received from survivors on that project is similar to this one now. And we also tested it with some survivors and some DV lay advocate, just from DV programs. And the feedback was phenomenal. And I think it improved our interview 200%. So I think that's one of the things. And then this other thing is we use these various collaboration tools that Quinten referred to, Slack, GitHub, what else? Zoom, and there's one other one. I can't remember this. Anyway, the point is that we have to, what is it?
Trello is the other big one.
Oh, Trello, yeah, that's right. So we used all of those tools, but also we worked, part of this collaboration is that people helped each other learn to use the tools, because each one of those tools has a certain degree of intimidation to it. And people just get, we kept getting, like, even now we're getting people to sign up to work with us. And so we have this infrastructure where we start from ground zero and pull people in. So that's very exciting. Unfortunately, I think we do need well, I don't know if we need a crisis to collaborate. You guys could all put in the chat what you think about that, because I think that's a really interesting question.
And I just alluded to this just really briefly. So one of the things that I'm excited about is that, yes, all of the work that we've done, I do want to acknowledge, like, I think a really important part of it was we can email these forms to the court directly. And I think that's not going to last forever. That's something that is temporary to the COVID crisis. But we know that we can move on to doing other kinds of e-filing that work better for the court systems. And that is what the next phase of our project is finding national partners who are ready and have the capabilities to do maybe being an e-filing service provider. And I'm really hopeful that there's maybe someone who's listening out there who has that interest and expertise. But of course, we'll be continuing to have that conversation. Seeing a lot of good points in the Slack here on the channel, that it can be an accelerant to have a crisis. That's a really good point.
If we think about it too, when you think about crisis, so the pandemic is a crisis, but I think if you think about the people who are using our forms, probably every single one of them is in crisis. And we have to just keep including our users as our colleagues and as our collaborators. And in that way, any feedback we get from them helps us improve the product that we offer to anybody. And one example of that is, I'm sure you all are aware of the National Eviction Moratorium, the CDC moratorium. I think within 24 hours of it being announced, Quinten put together an interview very quickly that anybody could use across the country to send a declaration to their landlord. And within a few weeks, you've done like 65 revisions of that interview based on feedback that people sent you. It's phenomenal, right? And that has improved the tool to no end, as well as made it available to more and more people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Quinten and Carolyn. We're gonna pop a poll while we move over to Johanna and the judge. And I do want to ask one question. Actually, let's do the poll first, and then I'll ask a question of you, and then that the judge and Carolyn and Johanna can consider during their portion of the presentation. This is great. This is fascinating.
You know what we don't have in here is a sense of humor.
I think that would have been #1 by far.
That's a good question. If there's something missing, participants could write it in the chat as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Johanna. Yeah, if there's something that you feel really strongly about that you don't see here that you really value when collaborating, yeah, go ahead and pop it in the chat. Okay. I think we're good to go, Rochelle, with this poll. That's awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely be looking over that a little bit more later.
So the red one is the one that gets the highest. That's the thing that most people agree on, the accessing expertise.
Yeah, followed closely by knowledge sharing, which is great. sharing the responsibility, that was pretty low. Everyone's like just ready to go and take up the responsibility. That's great. Okay, we're gonna switch over to Johanna and the judge. But one question I'd just like to pose to you, Carolyn and Quinten, and that maybe the judge and Johanna can consider is how do you identify partners to collaborate with? Is it an organic process? Is it a very proactive process? What does that look like?
I found it very organic, and it was really amazing to see like an outpouring of people. I think a crisis, that's one thing a crisis is good for, is having people feel like, yeah, I have time, I want to pour my energy into this right now. So by having so many people who were ready to step up, it made it easy to identify good partners, because we weren't trying to search out a good partner just by sheer force of numbers. There were so many people who were participating that we were going to find them, and they were the ones who were going to stick around and make it work. Sometimes not having a partner can be a blocker, but that was not a problem because we had so many people who wanted to participate. I don't know if you have, I'm sure you have other things to add to that, Caroline.
I guess that I think we're really fortunate because I think personality plays a huge part in a successful collaboration. And we were really fortunate in the breadth of volunteers we had, but we also had indispensable, unique people who were very good at specific things. And our one volunteer, she knows how to manage everybody and a meeting with a sense of humor and still make progress. I mean, it's just you couldn't have put together a job description that I mean, she really kind of wrote it. And so the organic part of it allows people to work to their strengths, which really contributes hugely to the collaboration.
I would say that's a really good point. I mean, it sounds like a funny thing to say. I'm going to say, like, we did a good job of not letting egos get in the way for the most part, because that person who Caroline's talking about is a volunteer from South Africa who ended up doing like 60 hours a week of work for us just for the experience and the commitment and passion to the project. But we also had to know for her to step up and do that, we had to know we were looking for people to volunteer for managing the project. Like, that was a role we had to not try to hog for ourselves.
Yep.
She was able to step up and fill.
Awesome. And I think we all experience that, and that it all starts with relationships, right? If you organic way of collaborating, it starts with building relationships. So, all right, we're going to move on to Johanna and the judge. Take it away, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'll just start sharing my screen. And if you could let me know if you can see it. How does that look?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you very much. My name is Johanna Santos Bassetti. I work at justfix.nyc as the Director of Product. And I'm very honored to be here with Judge Schneider to present about how we collaborated on a project that was to create an emergency tool for unrepresented tenants to be able to file emergency actions to get repairs or stop harassment. And so the collaboration was between justfix.nyc, which is a startup in the housing movement, and the court. And I'll pass it on to the judge if you would like to add anything to that.
I'm convinced that one of the main reasons that I'm here in this illustrious group is to demonstrate that you can have a successful tech collaboration with someone who has little, if any, familiarity with tech solutions, but at least has learned that I need help. Let me set the scene a little bit. The New York, I see among you that there are quite a number who are familiar with the New York City Housing Court and have a sense of what it's like. I have been a judge in that court for 23 years, and I was a civil legal services lawyer practicing in that court for 20 years before that. That gives you an idea how old I am, since I did have to go to law school before that. And I would just say in my tech biography, I have to tell you that I graduated from law school before there was computerized legal research. Also am involved with a court, which is a profoundly mid-20th century institution. Some would say 19th, maybe the late 19th century institution. It has, at least before the pandemic, it was a place where judicial orders and stipulations of settlement were written with pens on carbon sets, where literally everything happened in the court building, nothing away from the court building, and where there was really profound resistance to becoming more 21st century. And I think that the court is busy, 225,000 cases a year, 50 judges, 7 different locations around the city. 90% of the landlords have lawyers, 65% of the tenants do not. Eviction cases form more than 90% of the court's work. Tenant-initiated cases involving repairs, illegal lockouts, and harassment are less than 10%. The court has always been entirely paper. Even our digital case management system is so poor at producing statistics that we do hand-counted, filled in form once a month to collect monthly statistics. And I can't, Johanna asked me while we were working on this, what's the explanation for the resistance to using technology to get better? And I think many of my colleagues would say, well, we're afraid that our unrepresented litigants will be left behind by technical solutions. I think that many of the non-judicial workers in the court would say we'll lose track of everything if we don't have our paper to hold on to. So I was thinking as I was listening to Quinten and Caroline speak, they talked about, do you actually need a crisis? I think one of the things that you need a crisis for is to push change where there's resistance to it. I love this quote, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think it was popularized by Rahm Emanuel, but it's attributed to Winston Churchill from sometime during the Second World War. COVID happened to us. The court closed. I loved Quinten's slide with the chain on the gate. And we needed to try to create some way for tenants who had emergency repairs, that flood in the basement, to be able to bring an emergency case to court without coming to court. New York was in complete lockdown, and we wanted people to be able to have emergency access to the courts. So I had met some of the people from Just Fix who were trying to use technology to assist people who were doing tenant organizing and tenant advocacy, and had found the court nothing but resistant. Johanna will tell you a little bit about that. And I said, help, help, help. I have no idea how to do this. Can you create a tool which is available online, which will enable a tenant to file an emergency case seeking a repair order? Over to Johanna.
Thank you, Judge. Yeah, and so why would the court know to contact us, right? So this project from justfix.nyc and actually started a few years ago through a TIG grant in collaboration with Pro Bono Net, Law Help Interactive, and Legal Services NYC. And so there's an original 1.0 version of this tool that we then enhanced. So one could say that we had a head start. And we had been trying to integrate that with the court for a while, but in the in-person context, the tool was limited to having this kind of questionnaire type interface that Quinten was describing, and then generating the PDF that is the pro se forms, but then we weren't able to submit it to the court. The tenant had to print it out and take it to the clerk in person. The clerk had to make various photocopies of it so the judge could sign. It had to be mailed in the traditional manner and notarized in person. And so that project had been, to be honest, sort of like dragging its feet. It was challenging to have a tight feedback loop because there wasn't this sense of like crisis urgency that Judge Schneider was speaking about. And so once that did come around, we were really excited. We were like, okay, great. Now we have sort of the go ahead from the court, and not just the go ahead, but like the court is asking us to do it. So we got really excited and we had the resources and the excitement and will to move quickly. And this shared sense of urgency became sort of the fire that got lit in this collaboration. And so what we were able to do was create this emergency HP action tool that has document assembly and can be filed by email, the same way as the tool that Quinten was describing. And it took the version 1 and created a version 2, which we call the emergency HP action tool, because during the beginning of the pandemic, only emergency actions were taken. Things such as lack of heat and hot water, lack of cooking gas, things that would really put you in a really tough situation if you're quarantining at home. And so instead of having notarization in person, we had to integrate e-signature. And then instead of filing in person, we had to file online via email. And then normally you have to pay $45 to start a case, but the court didn't have a way to pay that fee. And so you couldn't keep that as a blocker. And so you had to have an automatic fee waiver for every litigant. So those are the things we had to solve for. And we had these 2 primary interventions. There were definitely a lot of different things that, you know, from the JustFix end, we could just do on our own. But the 2 primary things that we had to collaborate on were e-signing in place of in-person notarization and simplifying the fee waiver. And one thing that I find really interesting about this is that there's 2 sides. There's the technological solve, but then there's also this procedural solve. You know, we can't just say, okay, we're gonna integrate e-signing and ta-da. We had to actually have permission for that. And that permission came in the way of regulations being eased for that.
And one of the things I want to add about that is that the governor of New York adopted an emergency order that created a special emergency way to notarize a document. But the emergency way to notarize a document was, if anything, more cumbersome than the existing way. You had to be on a video hookup and show a photo ID. And to be perfectly honest, the way that we dealt with getting by the notarization systems was, we just said, it's an emergency, we're just gonna sign it. And when the case gets in front of a judge, the judge will ask the petitioner to swear that everything in the petition is true, and we'll get by it that way.
It sounds almost sneaky, but it was very effective. And then the other intervention point was this fee waiver that I was speaking about. So the original tool asked, let's say 21 questions, and 8 of those were for the fee waiver. So at justfix.nyc, when we build a product like this, we want to reduce as much as possible the burden on the tenant, make an interface that's super smooth, doesn't use legalese, really walks you through it as if the interface were your friend. And we take the philosophy that if you don't need to ask a question, then cut it out. And so since the fee waivers were going to be across the board, we didn't need to ask those 8 questions. So we took them out and instead automatically created a very simplified fee waiver language, affidavit, and we had to get that approved. And that was sort of like a back and forth, give and take, and progressively all of the judges started accepting it. Let's see. So one can say that you can create the technology, but how do you actually get it to work when you're integrating it with the human element, right? This, you can send the files to a clerk, but a clerk is also, has been working at the court for 40 years. There's processes that they're very familiar to, that they've gotten to be really, really good at. And, imagine you're in their place and all of a sudden this new thing comes up and you're in a sense forced to use it. That's not a really nice spot to be in. And so we had to figure out a way to make that process as easy as possible and really make clerks understand that we're there with them and we want to have their feedback to create the process that also works for them. And then we also had to figure out how to create processes that work across the 5 boroughs. That's its own kettle of fish that I won't focus on today. And so one of the things that happened is we focused on the clerks, and it was really sort of like getting your hands dirty, email, call, text, rinse, repeat all day long. And it was primarily me handling this relationship building because we're only a team of 8, so there wasn't that many people to spread around the emailing and calling and texting. And what I found was that previously when we had the version one tool, when I walked into the court to assist tenants filing in person, there was an almost like adversarial nature of the interaction with pro se tenants. And so I personally had sort of fear at working with the clerks. But over time, we actually started becoming buddies. And that was one of the most gratifying parts of the project, being able to nurture relationships and be able to make them feel safe, that if we are implementing something that's new, we're also not sort of just like throwing it at them and then leaving them alone.
I want to insert something here that Johanna is being very humble here. She was extraordinarily good at building those relationships. I had a clerk tell me just recently, I've been doing this job for 30 years and now suddenly I don't know how to do the job anymore because the job has changed completely. Johanna seemed to have a grasp of that, and the fact that she was talking to human beings who were profoundly befuddled by what was going on and trying to adjust. And she very much approached them in, tell me what your difficulties are and let's see if I can help solve them, which I thought was terrific.
Thank you so much. Makes me all warm inside to hear that. So that was one approach. And then we took sort of a double whammy approach to getting clerk buy-in by doing trainings. So we held a training for all the clerks. Everybody was invited and encouraged to come. And we walked them through the process and how the tool works. And our intention was to build excitement, build community, ask a lot of questions, make sure that we understand the clerks' experiences and also that there's a space for clerks to learn from one another. And that, I think, is the most fundamental part, that there's collaboration, not just between, our organization and the court, but within the court, different entities and different individuals who are sharing learning. And these are the stats of how it's been working. As of yesterday, we've had 923 cases filed since April when we launched. And one thing that's pretty interesting is that I asked Judge Schneider for a tally of all of the cases that had been filed, and then I took the numbers from us and calculated that we actually had processed 52% of all of the HP action cases that had happened during COVID until now. And we've seen this nice up and to the right curve of progressive adoptment, which is, in technology, what you want to see. And now I'll pass it back to Judge Schneider.
What the crisis did for us was to put everybody on the same side. The court in the crisis desperately needed to be able to do things in a different way. And Johanna and the other folks she was working with got to know the people in the courthouse and got to be able to work with them. I think our challenge going forward is to try to build on this. I'm hopeful that at some point in the future, the crisis will wane. But one of the things that happened at the same time as we were using the Just Fix tool to start code enforcement cases, the housing court began to use an e-filing system. So one of the next challenges will be to see if we can bring this online tool to a place where it can connect with our e-filing system rather than the old way, which was to print it out and carry it to court, or the current way, which is to send it by email to a clerk who prints it out and wind up getting some kind of an integration with e-filing. I will tell you that this is going to be a heavy lift because the court system itself has had a number of do-it-yourself forms that are available on the court website, and none of those connect directly to the e-filing system. All of those produce a document that has to be, if you want to put it through the e-filing system, you would have to print it and then upload it. It doesn't even produce a PDF. You have to print it and then upload it and then send it on the e-filing system, our own forms. So this is going to be a real challenge, but we have the success of this emergency project as motivation. And I think, you know, there are other things, smaller things that are challenges going forward. For example, can we use our experience with this and the fact that disposing with, essentially, I shouldn't use that language, but disposing with formal notarization did not cause the sky to fall. Can we convince the legislature to adopt a more modern approach to swearing to the truth of a court document? I've recently been asked for legislative priorities, and that's right at the top of mine at the moment. It's also, this project showed us where we had challenges in terms of the effort to be uniform across our 7 locations. Obviously, everywhere that you have personalities, and our personalities often stay in one place for a long, long time, they develop their own ways of doing things, and therefore the different places have slightly different procedures and different resistance points. And then, you know, an additional problem and something that we really have to get at is the absence of good metrics, the absence of good data in our court, and the fact that we really, really need it in order to get better at everything, including better at our use of technology. And I think we've learned that although some of our litigants really don't have access to technology, more of them do than we would have predicted at the start of this. And that's been a really, really important lesson as well. Johanna?
Yeah, I wanted to add one more thing that we were talking about yesterday, Judge Schneider, is about language accessibility.
Yeah.
One of the next steps for the tool is to translate it into Spanish first. And we come across a pretty substantial barrier in that on the court side, there aren't very few if any, court forms that are in Spanish. And so, you know, when you have someone create a document, if you have a Spanish speaker answering questions in Spanish, and then we translate that into English forms, having them sign English forms is very much not ideal. You don't want someone obviously signing something they can't understand. And so one of the things that we would love to do at justfix.nyc is to collaborate in a next phase with the court in creating language accessibility. And that's it for us. Thank you so much, everybody.
That was really great. I mean, I could listen to this for forever, because I'm really intrigued about the e-filing part, and about, you know, what's the next step in making that truly e-fileable. And but I know we have about 2 minutes left, and I wonder, could each of you just go around and let us know, like, what was the technology, what was your favorite tools, maybe like the top 2 in this collaborative effort? And it could be anything like a telephone, but it'd be interesting to hear what each of you thought was really like your top tools.
We only had one tool, which was email. Well, I guess technically Zoom, because we did have Zoom calls, but Zoom and email were our big.
And Zoom for the training.
Oh yeah, and Zoom for the training.
But we did almost everything with email.
Yeah.
Clumsy as that is.
We kind of lived between, like, doing, for quite a while, for the first phase of the project, we had daily Zoom meetings, and then we used Slack and Google Docs quite a bit for collaborating in between. Or on calls. Google Docs is amazing, like how much nicer it is to have collaborative notes everyone can see at once as you're typing. And that's like one of the little side benefits of people having virtual meetings.
Yeah, Google Docs and Slack, can't go wrong with that. Zoom
Well,
in between there.
I think one of the things that's a little bit different about our project from Just Fix NYC is that because we were having so many people working on the same thing. We started off with Google Docs, and I'm still a little bit terrified of GitHub, but I understand, I get it now, why it's so valuable. And I'm like, I was a GitHub hater coming in. And, but I think that for the project that we were doing, where it's like track changes in Word, it's essential when you're having many people working on one thing, so that you're not passing copies of things around to each other.
Yeah.
And what I keep pushing is that our new people, if we don't forget about GitHub, just make sure that you create an account, follow these directions, follow these directions, follow these directions. And but I don't see how we could have done without any of the tools that we used.
Yeah. And look, I just want to be mindful of the time. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you to our panelists. This is really a really interesting and meaningful discussion. So remember that go to your next session, go back to Sketch, and then choose whatever session you want to go to, and you'll find the Zoom link in there. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.